Welcome to the Good Faith Podcast. I'm your host, Curtis Chang. And the Good Faith Podcast is where friends who follow Jesus help each other make sense of the world. And one of the primary ways that we make sense of the world is through marriage. Now, this is certainly true if you are currently married. Like something happens in the world, my wife Jody is going to be the first person I turn to and say, "Can you believe this happened?" Or how, what do you think of this? But here's a truth that's often not acknowledged, that even if you're not currently married, marriage still serves as a lens on the world for you. And this could be through a past marriage you've had, or especially for all of us, it would be the marriage of our parents who shape how we look at the world. And this is why I'm so glad to invite back onto the Good Faith my good friend Dan Allender. Dan is a renowned therapist who's written numerous books on trauma, abuse, healing, love, forgiveness, and he's recently written with co-author Stephen Hall a wonderful book on marriage called The Deep-Rooted Marriage. Dan, welcome back to the Good Faith Podcast.
Thank you, Curtis. It's, this is one of those painful realities of I would just love to be with you physically someday, let alone just digitally, but it's an honor to be with you.
Well, and when we get together, if I come visit you, we'll play ping pong because right behind you is a ping pong table. That would be fun to do. So, all right, Dan, let's get into it. You've written a book on marriage, and I've just made the point that marriage shapes how we look at the world. Why is that? Explain why marriage is so fundamental. Some marriage is so fundamental to how we do this.
Well, I love the idea that we look through the world through a lens. And the question is, what lens do we see reality through? And because we are Trinitarian, because we believe God is three persons in one, we look through the world through the lens of relationships. And there's no relationship that bears more beauty, more brokenness. I've said many times, I have never had more of a taste of what I believe I will know in eternity, heaven, than I have had through relationship with Becky. And I've never had a taste of what I will not have to suffer. That is the reality of hell, more so than in any other relationship than through my wife. So every marriage, I believe, is a relationship of extremity unless you're bored.
All right. So if relationships are the way in which we look through the world as good Trinitarians, and marriage is a central relationship, whether you're married currently or not, and we'll talk a little bit about, how past marriage, especially the marriage of our parents, shape us. But I want you to give an example. So for instance, one thing that is true about the world right now, I think I can say this accurately, is that it is filled with anxiety.
Yes.
Our politics, our economics are just filled with uncertainty, with fear. Break this down. How does marriage shape how we process the anxiety in the world?
Well, let's just start with maybe the most obvious sentence in the universe, and that is we live in a traumatic time. And anytime you live east of Eden, there is a reality of trauma. But we're living in a culture that is so fragmented, so untrustworthy, so deeply questionable about what is true, what is not true, what will be true with regard to our democracy. And again, it sounds ridiculous, but tomorrow, next week, next month, we're not just talking years from now. So we're living in a highly traumatized era. In that, trauma always brings these three realities: fragmentation, something in your left frontal lobe, particularly Broca's area, goes a bit offline. So the moment where anxiety comes in, we're experiencing that fragmentation. And the natural result of our body, because indeed of our vagal nerve that runs from our occipital lobe all the way through our guts, our splagna, into our legs, we get numb, we dissociate, we disconnect. And in that, we begin to isolate. So if we start with two words, we're living in a fragmented, traumatic world. And for a lot of us, even normal conflicts have at least a degree of fragmentation. When Becky and I fight, and we can get into the particulars. We fight, and it's loud and it's intense. And I know for both of us, we begin to feel a little bit of our current, but also past trauma. So if we're looking at two worlds, our world outside is profoundly traumatized.
Mhm.
Oftentimes in a marriage, that trauma outside seeps inside and begins to dishevel something of the relationship that might have some fragility from the past, but even more so has it now.
Well, talk to me from your both the book and from your own counseling experience, like, because you must be seeing couples right or individuals right now who are feeling a lot of anxiety from the world. How are you seeing that fragmentation and disassociation working itself out in marriage and both negatively and perhaps is there some positive dimension of it? Is there some way in which marriages can stabilize us, can actually
Yeah.
reattach us? Talk about both directions.
Well, I don't have to look far. I can look in the mirror. And Becky and I had this conflict over a baked potato a few weeks ago. And from my standpoint, when I put the fork in it, it wasn't done. From her standpoint, it was quite well done. And already we're in this, it's done. No, it's not done. Well, how do you know it's not done? It's not done. And as we spiraled pretty quickly, being triggered into a level of intensity,
Mm.
thank goodness, Becky was able literally physically to step back and just start laughing. And she's like, what's going on? We are happy. We're in our 48th year of marriage, and we're having not the worst fight of our lives, but unpleasant interaction about the heat intensity of a baked potato. Again, I'm not going to claim that's all due to what's happening outside.
Sure.
There's a degree of immaturity I'll claim for myself. But what was going on is we're being triggered.
Yeah.
And there's something in the process outside. Our worlds are not doing well outside. But it began to seep into, this absolutely unimportant matter. But if you understood our story, Becky had what I would call a very angry, cruel mother. But the only place where there was a sense of goodness was the kitchen. So it's her domain, and
Mm.
she does brilliantly. So I'm challenging, not purposely, but I'm challenging the place where love is most solid for her.
Mm.
And at that point, she's threatened. And she intensely responded, which only brought me to a point because I lived with a very fragile, we'll call it borderline personality disordered mother. And so you get intense with me as my mother would, well, we're going to have a fight. So our past lives are showing up in the context of a disheveled country in the middle of an utterly unimportant matter. And again, I say, thank goodness, we've done enough work that we caught ourselves a little bit sooner than we might have 5 or 10 years ago. But we've got to have the ability to say, how does the past leak into the present? Because oftentimes the surface issues we're fighting about are not the issue at hand. And if we can begin to separate surface structure, which is not to say superficial, just means on the external, to get to the issue of the heart. And I think that's where we can begin to play between the cultural reality and the marital realities. Do we have an orientation to be able to get to the heart? And if so, it changes, not to a point where you don't struggle, but it gives you more language and more grounding to engage what's really happening.
So it sounds like you're saying there's two sources that can actually fuel conflict. That's actually not about the conflict itself. That's not about Potato Gate. Like there's a underlying
I love
sources
that.
of
I'm going to use that potato gate.
it. It's either our outside world, like what's happening in the world that's making us tense, fragmented, anxious, uh, or it's our own past, perhaps especially in our family of origin, that also is getting triggered, right? So if those are our two things that we're fighting, so that we need to overcome, such that we're actually dealing with the other person as they really are.
Yes.
What are some tools for us to do that? It sounds like
Well,
naming is it seems like a critical one, right? Being
oh,
able to
it's it
name,
it
yeah.
it, it may be 80% right
Okay.
there, just to be able to go rather than indeed to hour ago we had a conversation with our financial advisor, and as most people would say, it's things are not well. And as they're trying to calm my heart, the reality is they did a really good job. But the only one that really mattered at that point was my wife, who took hold of my hand and just said simply, we can actually trust the one we prayed to this morning.
Mm,
And it wasn't a big sentence, it didn't radically change, but it was an orientation. So I think a lot of what we're having to do in our culture is to reorient. But here's the dilemma. Sometimes that orientation has to happen 10 or 20 times in a matter of an hour to
mm.
be able to go, I'm not your enemy. We're fighting right now. Things are not well. I don't even know what's going on. I know whatever it is, it's not the bottom line of a baked potato. Nonetheless, can we stay in this long enough to go, what's going on around us?
Yeah,
What is going on in us?
yeah.
And that includes the past. So, just that alone, working on reorientation, constantly coming back to say, we've got to get grounding, got to get a ground that has a solidity that is not based on what's happening in the world or even what's happening inside of me. I've got to have a ground to begin to go, we can interpret this together if we begin to have language that is not built on contempt, not built on judgment, not built on trying to resolve the problem. That's huge because in most marriages, when there's conflict, somebody wants to be right or
Mm,
both want to be right. And in that, you get slid into this cycle of judgment, which is another word for the word contempt. So if we can get orientation, we want kindness. We want, even at best, or I mean at worst, civility. But we want something that allows us to keep the connection we know we both desire. That changes almost everything.
Dan, it's so funny that what you're talking about, what is needed in a marriage is to steer away from contempt, to just even look for civility, to assume the best of the other. That it so perfectly mirrors what we need in our civil society and our political discourse right
Yeah.
now, which further to the point of that there is this strange connection between marriage and how all of our other relationships in society in the world that seem fractured. We all need the same qualities, and it's in marriage that we actually can experience maybe something of what it would mean to be healed. Maybe, hopefully, even in our civil society. And to that point of healing, I want you to tell the story in your book about how marriage made sense of your world on the ski slopes when you're watching, when you're trying to make sense of what was happening to your son. Because I thought that was such a beautifully told story, and it's illustrative of how a healthy marriage can actually do that regrounding that you're talking about, such that we're not reacting out of these other stimuli.
Well, before I jump, I'll simply say in my family of origin, particularly with my mother and I yelled at each other a lot. She was mentally ill, and my way of engaging the complexity of relationship with her was to match her intensity by a kind of aggregation of intensity to more intensity back and forth. Becky lived in a world in which it was so dangerous to have a voice, to speak any thought or feeling, no matter if it was 5 minutes ago in agreement with what her parents said about religion or about politics, it didn't matter. It would be turned on her as she was stupid and a fool. So you've got two different dynamics. I'm intense, I'm verbal. She has a kindness and a quality of quiet. It worked well for us for a long time, but this one story was a major point of change for us. We were skiing early season, very little snow. Our girls wanted to go in quickly for an early lunch. And my son, who was about 8, my wife and I were on a very blue slope, but a lot of ice. And my son was terrified. He had had a severe fall the year before. And he was like, Mom, you've got to get the car. Sorry, son, you just can't get the car up here. So I was pressing him to get down. You can do this. Come on, let's go. And Becky finally looked at me and said, why don't you go on down? I'll get him down. I went down about 300 yards, waited for the moment. And I could see this kind presence encouraging her son. And he collapsed on the snow. And I could see he was kicking his skis off, and it wasn't working. So after about 10 minutes, I was enraged, and I began the arduous climb back up. And it was icy slope, and there's a way to get up there but slip and slide. And by the time I got there, I was as if I'd been in a spa for an hour. I was boiling hot, but if you know the term, cold anger. Put my skis on, slid over to them, and Becky slid in front of my son. And I knew what she was doing. She was protecting him. And I verbally, just hardly even yelled, just mouthed the word move. And I saw this slight, not severe, but slight little turn of her head, like, no, I'm not going to move. I got up to her face to face and I said, I was about to say, move again. And she spoke these words. She said, I know the men who have humiliated you. Now, in that one simple sentence, she literally brought this cascade. My father, mentors, other pastors, professors, it was literally like a kaleidoscope of images. And it all happened so quick. And I don't know how she then brought this next sentence about, but then she said, I know that is not what you want to do with your son. And in that 2-sentence interaction, again, why today, that day, did tears come? And 100 other days, I was cold and hard. But whatever reason, the Spirit was inviting me to a reality of, I am about to humiliate my son the way I have done and been done. And so tears came, and she looked at me and she put her hand more firmly on my heart. And she said, and it is to this day, the greatest accolade I've ever had. And she said, you are a good man. And then she skied away. Wow. That's the beginning of the context of looking at my son, who's now on the ground alone with his angry father. And I had nothing else I could do but to get on the ground with him and ask for forgiveness. And after a few moments, I think he was in many ways mimicking his mother, but he put his hand on my heart and he said, Dad, Mom's right. You are a good man, even if you're angry too much. Well, there's more to the story, but the bottom line is, without my wife's courage, but also kindness, to speak to the deepest parts of who I want to be, but also to stand in the way of who I don't want to be. That opened up conversations with our whole family, opened up an interaction of a clarity of, oh my gosh, I am replicating the harm I've endured in the core relationship, that where I want to bring something of the wonder and goodness of the grace of God. So we all need exposure, but we also need the invitation that you find in Genesis 3, and that question that God asks Adam, where are you, Adam? You know, was that sentence said with a tonality of contempt, with anger, or with sorrow and invitation? And that's what often has to happen. Again, it's not the only, but it's part of the reality of, we get to be the face of God to one another. And that's why we call it the deep-rooted marriage. You can bring the reality of transformation in a way that no other person on the earth will bring in the same way, because no one sees you at your best, and certainly no one sees you at your worst like your spouse does.
Dan, you've a lot of your stories in the book and even what you've said in this podcast talk about the power of a past marriage, namely the marriage of our parents.
Yeah.
And I think that's important because, I have a lot of listeners who are not married themselves, either have never been or are divorced. But I think it's impossible, I think, to read your book and not realize, oh, wow, my parents' marriage is like almost a character in my current marriage, either marriage or relationships or just life. Um, how how does that show up in other ways than when you are married? Like, let's talk to somebody who's individual or even maybe a young adult or something like that. How does your parents' marriage uh, kind of shape how you view relationships?
Well, if we begin with, from my standpoint, a biblical worldview of hamartiology or sin, the reality is Jesus says it pretty bluntly and clearly. You and I and our parents have two core issues: lust and anger. Lust is another word for desire gone mad. Put it in a more cultural standpoint, it's exploitation. We use the other on our own behalf to fill some core emptiness that we have not engaged with regard to our relationship with God. Then, when we don't get what we want, what we demand, we make someone pay. And that could
Mm,
be ourselves. It's not that our violence is always directed outside, but that contempt directed toward others or ourselves is what I believe Jesus is getting at with the word anger or murder. So we can say, no matter how good your parents were, they were sinners. And if you say they're not, Jesus, through John in 1 John 1, says you're a liar. So here's the dilemma. You were raised by an adulterer and a murderer. That's one parent. And another adulterer and murderer, your other parent. Or if you were, a single parent family, then clearly all that's going to be placed into the presence of one parent. Back to the phrase, no matter how good, no matter how loving, no matter how Christian, they struggle with sin. Therefore, they used you and they made you pay. And I'll tell you, that is so disturbing to even people who have endured really, really obviously very dysfunctional families, because we don't really want to see that in ourselves, let alone in others. So, how did your parent use you? And they did. How did they make you pay when you didn't fill them in the way you desire? That's another word for developmental trauma. Now, if your parents were emotionally abusive, physically abusive, sexually abusive, we're not talking about developmental trauma alone. We're talking capital T trauma. And in the effect of whether it is more family of origin developmental trauma or severe, the fact is you learn to survive even before you had language. Again, what research is indicating is a child as young as 4 years of age is able to address the motivation of a parent. Not in sophisticated language, but they can put words to what a parent's doing with them that the parent does not want that child to see. So when you begin to go at age 4, you knew your parent was lying. You knew your parent was pretending, and you had to cope with that without having language, sophistication, structure. And so you learn to adapt, you learn to survive. And that survival structure becomes cellular. It literally becomes, in one sense, imprinted in the way you engage. And we talk about that often in these 4 categories: fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. I don't want to spend much time on that other than to say trauma is so built into us, it feels like that's just who we are. That's just who I am. I'm more belligerent. Becky is more quiet. She's more apt to flee. I'm more apt to fight. Well, in the process of realizing that those patterns don't just go away because you came to Christ. Those patterns don't go away because you got your college degree. They are survival structures that until you begin to unearth, you begin to address. Address means speak to. Like the psalmist in Psalm 42, oh, my soul, why are you downcast within me? When we begin to create a dialogue, inner dialogue, but also a dialogue relationally, not just with our spouse, but with God, then we've got the potentiality of beginning to see, in some ways, new attachment structures that can change, deeply change, literally, our brains. I think that's one of the most marvelous things we've discovered with regard to trauma. There is a kind of malleability and transformational nature to our brains, but it only changes in the context of a renewed, repeated, and redeemed quality of love.
And that's where you get to where I think a healthy marriage can be that context of healing. Um, but I gotta say, Dan, that kind of work that you're talking about of digging into one's past, admitting really uncomfortable things about our own parents, perhaps, that seems like exhausting. That seems like really hard work. Like, what motivates people to do that? Or when do you know I got to do that work?
Well, I don't want to compare it to flossing, but I remember my dentist saying to me, do you understand your inability to address plaque because you're not flossing is not only creating havoc in your teeth, but it has a potential to lead to a heart attack.
Mm,
You're going to pay now or you're going to pay later. You're going to pay. What's your choice? So, in one sense, yes, I couldn't agree with you more. At times, to be able to just like have a conflict over a baked potato and just have one of us go, wow, you're crazy. And the other go, yeah, I'm so sorry. That was wrong. Versus having to go, what's going on? Well, I'm in my wife's domain, and it's still, even though we've dealt with it countless times, it's almost that sense of you have no right to question me in the realm where I know life.
mm.
Well, all I'm saying is the hard work of being instoried and embodied. Like you don't really have a choice, but you do. And if you're going to avoid that choice, then the story is going to eventually consume you, and your body will not lead and go in directions that literally bring life. So I love your question because it's the one that all of us are wrestling with. We're busy. We're in a crazy world. It's too overwhelming already. How in the world am I supposed to put time in to engage how my angry mother or how my passive distant father is playing out in relationship right now over a baked potato?
Yeah.
And the answer is, well, first of all, it is. It's like cancer. It is. What do you want to do about it? And the efforts to pretend, to avoid, only accelerate and intensify the things that you have not desired to engage.
Dan, shifting gears a little bit here, your book talks about various ways that uh, two spouses can get divided by contempt. So I want to ask you about politics because there's no place more great fulfilled with contempt than our politics. Have you ever counseled a couple who were actually divided by politics? And if so, what was that like?
I would almost want to say, have I ever worked with a couple that actually were in accord? Sometimes slightly in accord, but there's always. I start with this in every area of life, whether we're talking about sex, parenting, money, vacations. Almost never will you have everyone operating on the same level of desire in the same direction. So there will always be differences. And that's one of the core issues that evokes contempt. So, yeah, start with that as a premise. The Gottmans, a famous couple who do research in marriage, have come to a point well validated to be able to say that the number one killer of a marriage is contempt. And they can put you in a lab setting and watch you for less than an hour and make up to a 70% prediction of accuracy as to whether you'll be married 3 years from that point. So it is a big deal. I mean, this is not a matter of, oh, yeah, it shouldn't. No, contempt is the great killer. If we go back to the name of Satan, Satani, means the accuser. And the language of evil is the language of contempt, which is another word for the word judgment. The absence of compassion, the absence of curiosity with judgment equals contempt. And so when you've got that in a marriage, I can guarantee you the way you approach politics, without even a slight question, you will be a very contemptuous person in the differences you hold with others. Now, you might not have as obvious contempt in the context of your marriage and have it show up politically. But what I'm getting at is every marriage has contempt. Nobody escapes the use of contempt because it's our shield against shame.
Yeah.
The number one way we defend against the experience of feeling vulnerable, of feeling seen, is our use of contempt. Contempt for ourselves or contempt for others. So I know in every marriage situation, no marriage on the earth has escaped the role of contempt. So in my exposing, inviting a person to name contempt, it's always with a history of how their family or how their own life has been shaped to use contempt to escape something of the reality of what they do not want to face. And your brilliance in bringing, it's the killer of what's happening in our country. There are a lot of profound policy failures, but the major issue is we hold our so-called enemy not just with blame, but with disdain.
Yeah.
And when that becomes those two words, blame and disdain, it is murderous.
All right. So if one inescapable reality is contempt, there's another inescapable reality that you write about, especially near the end of your book, which is suffering. So can you talk about the interconnection between marriage and suffering? Why are those two realities so deeply intertwined?
Well, I'd start with East of Eden. Nobody who lives east of Eden is going to be able to escape what Paul calls in 2 Corinthians chapter 4, affliction. And the word he uses is literally the most severe word for suffering. Yet he has the audacity, almost ridiculous audacity, to call it light and momentary. So he's holding a paradox for us. I think marriage is full of affliction in terms of the disruption of my desire, lust, and at times the misuse of my anger, violence, murder. So marriage is going to be the one context for sure that's going to raise to the surface the reality of our own brokenness. But if there is some desire for goodness, it's also the context of where we want to bring to the other something good. We are the face of God on behalf of one another. And so when I see how I've failed my wife, if my heart's not pierced, pain, suffering, then there is something consciencelessness. The structure that I think is part of the political realm at this point is not mere arrogance, but narcissism, cruelty, judgment, gaslighting, every word that ultimately means a predatory violence against the other. But when I want to do good, truly good, a heaven on earth as it is, and even there, I don't bring my wife all that I would desire. There's a loss. So through my brokenness, even through my beauty, there is a grief I'm called to enter. And therefore we have the hope of the Beatitudes. Blessed are those who mourn. And marriage is a context to enter death. Like if you really believe the gospel, then you understand your life story is a reflection of his death and resurrection and ascension. So my marriage is a context of my brokenness and my beauty, bringing my grief to the surface. It's also the context where repentance, through kindness. It is the kindness of God that leads to repentance. Back to that phrase that Paul uses. Why do you treat the kindness of God with contempt? If we're
Mm,
willing to deal with contempt, I think what we'll find is the kindness of God and our own kindness toward the other begins to reshape the nature of how we relate to one another. And it
mm,
gives us power. It gives us the power of what the ascension is, and that is the gifting of the kingdom through the kingdom he's given us. So that's where my marriage is meant to be a reflection of
mm.
death, resurrection, and ascension. And if you think you can walk that path without going through the valley, the shadow of death, well, live into that illusion, pal.
Dan, I'm going to ask you some just practical advice questions, okay? Um, Talk to somebody who's listening who wants to get married, but they're not married right now. What advice would you give to that person?
Well, start talking to your friends and say something along the lines of, where do you see me use others? Where do you see me use you?
Huh.
Where
That's
do
an
you
honest conversation that's not often had in our society.
no, no. And where do you see me make you pay? Either by my withdrawal or by my intensity, or in other words, what I'm asking you to address is, are you a sinner? It might be helpful for you to get language about the kind of way. Look, it's true for all of us. We struggle with lust and anger, but the way you struggle with lust and anger may look dynamically different than how I do. So, having a mirror, that's what a marriage is. It's a mirror to reveal broken and beautiful. And so you can begin that with good friends. And if they are good friends, they have already read your mail. Now, I don't know if they're good enough friends to be willing
Tell
to
you the
risk.
truth. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
but let's assume they do. And
Yeah.
you'll have data you can wrestle with, not judgment, not go make a change, perform differently, but oh my gosh, so much of our brokenness is the very context of what God uses for his glory. So
Yeah.
we're not meant to go change. We're meant to be, in many ways, far more reflective and open.
All right. Dan, here's my next practical advice question. What would you say to somebody who says, well, I want to work on my marriage in sort of the ways that you're talking about, but my spouse doesn't? So what do I do?
Well, that's about 98% of the time.
Okay.
We do marriage intensive, Steve Call and I and our wives. And I would say always when a couple comes, one wants to come and the other doesn't. That's just like very seldom do you have both parties wishing to come. So when you open the door to the reality of what are you doing to escape hard conversations because they get angry or they withdraw, do you know enough of their story to know why they would get angry? Not just on the surface. Do you know how they've used anger as the means to escape their own grief and anxiety? Do you know how they get busy and escape by distraction because that's how they survived the midst of the home they were in? So if we can come to the structures that are very disappointing, but with a compassion, but also an ability to name, this is how you survived with your dad.
Mm.
You dismissed, and you're dismissive of me. Every time I bring something up, I see how you learned to live in that way with your dad because you had to. Am I your dad? Am I as angry as your dad is? So when you begin to connect past to present and opening the door to a conversation, I'm not going to say it's going to immediately open up the desire of the other, but it helps to give context in order to understand how things are playing out differently.
Okay, last one. This is in the just asking for a friend here category.
Just asking. I go ahead.
Yeah. What advice would you give to a couple as they enter or head into the empty nest stage?
Oh, baby. I remember with an older couple, I said, we've really planned a good year to really make this transition. And he looked at me, put his hand in the air, and he said, how many fingers? Count my thumb. And I went, 5. And he said, give up the notion of a year. It is a 5-year
Okay.
transition. That was so helpful, and I could have shot him. But let me bring it back to the reality of there is a loss for both of you, but likely a loss for one more than the other. And it's
Mm.
not necessarily the wife, the mother, but there's going to be different levels of grief and different levels of fear and different levels of desire. So, first and foremost, you got to wrestle with, how do we deal with differences historically? Has it gone well? Instead of looking for a solution, do we have curiosity to understand what those differences are made up of? So when you've got grief, fear, and desire, and that's the empty nest, grief, fear, and desire, then you've got to wrestle through all three, because they're interlocking, but baby, they're different. But you got to start structurally. Have we done well talking about,
Mm.
feeling, being present to one another where differences exist, whether it's sexual, whether it has to do whether we go to an Italian or Mexican restaurant tonight? How do we deal with that? So you grow there at least a little before you attempt to go into the issue of, what's the loss going to be? What's the fear going to be? And indeed, what desires are there now that there really is? I say a little more time, because a lot of folks are sending their children off to college, which means more debt, more uncertainty. So it isn't just there's more free resources, there's
Yeah.
a little more free time.
Yeah. Well, and it also strikes me what you're saying in terms of what's necessary to process that. It's kind of explains why there's so many divorces right around that stage of life, because
Yes.
you need to do that work. And if you haven't done the work up until that point, suddenly your kids are gone as a distraction or as just a common
Yep.
project
Yep.
for you to have. And you're left facing each other. And as you said, if you have not developed the ability to be curious about the other, to work through the differences, that's a pretty uncomfortable position to be in.
Well, and I know we're talking just theoretically, but
Yeah.
it again, given the brilliance of what you have invited the community of God to address with regard to anxiety, what I would say is, how you care for and how you've invited us to name and engage anxiety at a far more, what I want to call, gospel level.
Yeah.
That's where you go, depending on the things that are going on in your life. You don't manage what the future holds until you're
Mhm.
dealing well with the present. And you don't deal with the present well if you've not been open to engaging the past. So it's one of those, I know the inclination is, let's talk about the future, but we've got to be able to return to understand how our bodies, our soma, have been shaped by our own lives and the lives of others, so that we're not being triggered and we're not having to escape.
Dan, I want you to close here with a picture of what marriage does to us in terms of just redeeming us as human beings, and talk about Becky, your wife, and about how you have been redeemed for her. You gave a great story of that, but give a picture so that we can end with kind of the reality of God's good vision for marriage.
Well, we were in the middle of the loss of a dear, dear friend. We are in the dying age, and a dear friend of ours died. And at one point, there were tears and on my behalf. And as I was crying, my wife came and she put her hands on my face, and not to wipe the tears away, but to acknowledge these tears are
Mm.
beautiful. And I could feel something in me wanting to withdraw. I mean, I love her touch, but on the other hand, I felt very vulnerable, and a part of me just wanted to shut the tears down. That notion that nobody will hold your face, no one will see your tears, and also no one will call you into, in one sense, joining the sorrow of God. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. And her presence in honoring my tears actually brought not only an honoring to the heartache, but also a comfort. So I think in so many ways, a good marriage is what prepares us to being face to face with our lover and Savior, Jesus.
That is a great ending. So, listeners, I encourage you to go and buy the book, The Deep Rooted Marriage by Dan Allender and Steve Call. Dan, it is always such a pleasure to have you on The Good Faith. Thank you for joining us.
Oh, thank you, Curtis. Always a delight.
All right, listeners, join us next week as we will once again gather around the campfire.